For many people, Japan is still pretty mysterious, and that's not only because it's a country where people push their dogs around in prams and drink coffee in places full of cats. Not at all, in fact. Despite being an overpopulated area with scarce natural resources, Japan is one of the richest and most developed countries in the world, with the highest average life expectancy on the planet. So it's no wonder that it tends to amaze us in the West. But hold on a moment here, because Japan wasn't always the economic powerhouse that we know today. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Until the mid-19th century, this country operated under a political and economic system that was very similar to medieval Europe's. At that time, Japan was a poor and backward territory, closed off to the world with a strongly stratified society. Now the question is, how did the great change occur? How did Japan manage to rise up from its status as a poor rural country to that of a great industrial power? Was it all because of the influence and help of the United States after the Second World War? Was it the result of a meticulously designed plan by the government? Well, we can say that this entire process involved two major stages. We'll talk about the first one in this video, which began 150 years ago with the so-called Meiji Restoration. And yes, this did happen 150 years ago. 2018 is the 150th anniversary of this happening. The second stage, which we're going to talk about in a future video, and don't forget to subscribe so you get that, began at the end of the Second World War. But having said this, let's start with the story. So here we go.
The Meiji Restoration.
150 years ago, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 ended the dominance of the Tokugawa, a clan that for more than 250 years since 1603 had virtually supplanted the emperor's power, turning them into the great lords of Japan. We're talking about a long period during which Japan remained isolated from all contact with the outside world. And while many Western countries were throwing themselves into the Industrial Revolution, this isolation caused Japan to retain social, political, and economic structures that were more similar to the Middle Ages than modern times. At that time, Japan was a feudal society dominated by warlords, and for no less than 14 centuries had behaved like a kind of vassal state of the Chinese Empire. All of this very, very different from the Japan that we know today. We're talking about a country that prohibited the use of its ports by foreigners to stop their interference from contaminating the local culture and traditions. Of course, that also ended any trade and any possibility that its rigid political estates would move to the beat of the times. This was the situation until, in 1853, a modern US fleet arrived in Tokyo Bay with a mission and a message. Either the Japanese authorities accepted and allowed trade, or they'd have to face the consequences.
Steamboats. The hawks of the Pacific break their rest. 4 boats are enough to make us lose sleep at night. Japanese poem referring to the American ships that arrived in the country in 1853.
Obviously, the far less developed Japanese institutions could do little in the face of a modern, technologically advanced war fleet, so they had no choice but to accept and open up. That was the beginning of the end of the Tokugawa regime. Within a few years, disgusted by the more than palpable loss of sovereignty, by the humiliation of feeling like a poor and incapable country, and having seen the decline of the Chinese Empire, the samurai, which by the way were much more modern than those we usually see in movies, took control and they restored Imperial Japan. We're talking about the well-known Meiji Restoration, which against all odds launched Japan into the arms of a broad reform program that changed practically every field. After all, given the enormous technological, economic, and military superiority of the Western powers, the best way to preserve Japan's sovereignty was to take note and promote the country's development. And you know what? Well, they did just that. Within a few years, not even the Japanese themselves could recognize Japan. These are the steps that the country followed to jump from the feudal age right into the modern world. So listen up. At the political level, many of the old institutions were terminated and an independent judiciary power, a bicameral legislature, and a modern prefectural system were introduced to govern the country's various regions. The old taxes on the sale of rice were replaced by a land tax, which had two huge advantages. First, it facilitated the calculation of the revenues the government obtained each year. After all, the amount of land doesn't change, but the rice production does change every year, which allowed the government to, for example, design, finance, and build several infrastructure projects. This then helped determine land ownership with precision, establishing a modern property rights system for it. But that was not all. Being aware of the importance of knowledge and new technologies, in 1872, just 4 years after the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government established a universal primary education system, and within a few years, the Tokyo Institute of Technology and the University of Tokyo were created. And of course, in addition to everything we've seen, Japan's openness was also encouraged. Foreign experts and professionals were attracted to transmit their knowledge, and many Japanese students were granted scholarships to study both in Europe and in the United States. The result of this whole process was that in just 50 years, Japan managed to go through its own industrial revolution. That's 1/3 of the time it took Europe. That way, in the following decades, Japan continued its takeoff process and completely changed. And that's also when it began extending its influence to neighboring countries like Korea, China, Russia, and Taiwan. In 1902, they also signed a friendship agreement with Great Britain, an agreement that not only boosted its industry, but when World War I arrived, enabled Japan to become an important supplier, further boosting its economy. In these years, many Japanese entrepreneurs became millionaires. For one reason or another, in the end, when countries boost their trade, every party usually benefits. Mr. Trump, take note here. But folks, that's how we got to the year 1926, the year when the darkest time in Japan began.
The war economy.
1926, the year that Emperor Hirohito ascended the throne, where he remained all the way until 1989. And from that exact moment in the 1920s, Japan began to deepen its most warlike profile. In 1931, Japanese troops occupied the Chinese province of Manchuria, where they not only committed an enormous number of crimes, but in occupying the province, they also triggered the tense relations between Japan and most of the Western powers. And that's not all. Once Hirohito came to power, the government began to boost the war industry to such an extent that in 1931, while the troops invaded Manchuria, the Japanese government authorized and encouraged the creation of cartels among large companies, especially among the heavy industry. That is to say, the industry related to steel, boat, machinery, truck construction, etc. That way, the government could urge large companies to agree to increase production as quickly as possible while limiting the entry of new competitors. And that's not all. In the following years, the government also injected a lot of capital into these companies until it became co-owner of several of them. All the while, military spending, it just wouldn't stop growing. Of course, this massive amount of government intervention in the economy, it had consequences. Small businesses were ravaged, and almost every civilian industry closed long before the US bombing during World War II. The consequences of this war economy didn't only lead to a more authoritarian government and a greater military influence, which ultimately ended up in a war, but also in the general impoverishment of the Japanese. Now, of course, military material had to be produced instead of goods that would improve people's lives on a day-to-day basis. More rifles, less sewing machines. Ended up with the country being much poorer in the end. And you know what? It's not strange at all. History teaches us that militarist policies tend to be very efficient and boost the power of the elite while impoverishing the majority. The fact is that, as we all know, at the end of World War II, Japan wasn't only a defeated country, the Japanese economy, it was shattered, and the Japanese had gone back decades in terms of their standard of living. All this, of course, in addition to the tragedy of having lost more than 3 million lives during the conflict. Now, some of you may be wondering, but well, what happened after the war? How did Japan manage to become such a great power within just a few years? Well, folks, we're going to get into those answers in a future video here on VisualPolitik. So far in this one, we've already seen how Japan made the Great Leap and went from the Middle Ages to the modern world, and in the future, we're going to explore even more. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, of course, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.